The first thing my father dropped wasn't the wine glass. It was his smile. 1 second he was leaning back in his chair at the wedding reception, laughing with half the room red wine hanging carelessly from his fingers, while crystal chandeliers reflected across the ballroom ceiling. The next second all the color drained from his face, because Governor Daniel Mercer had just walked through the doors holding my daughter's hand. And everybody in Ohio recognized Daniel Mercer. Decorated Marine, 3-term governor, national television interviews, the kind of man veterans saluted instinctively and politicians feared privately. The music near the dance floor faltered awkwardly as heads turned across the ballroom. Then Mercer looked directly at me. "There you are, Captain Hayes," he said warmly. Lucy was looking for her mother. My father's wine glass slipped from his hand and exploded against the marble floor. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot. Nobody laughed after that. Not one person. My little girl Lucy tightened her grip on the governor's hand before running toward me in tiny white shoes and flower girl ribbons. "Mommy?" I caught her against my chest while the entire wedding reception stared at us in dead silence. Then Governor Mercer walked straight toward our family table. And my father, Richard Hayes, the loudest man in most rooms, his entire life suddenly looked like he forgot how to breathe. 3 hours earlier, before everything fell apart, I almost didn't attend the wedding at all. I should have trusted that instinct. The ceremony took place at a country club outside Columbus, one of those expensive places built beside rolling golf greens, where wealthy people hold events to remind each other they've done well in life. My younger sister Claire loved places like that. Claire always belonged naturally in polished rooms. Beautiful hair, perfect posture, the kind of smile photographers adore. At 34, she was marrying a corporate attorney from Cincinnati, whose family donated money to political campaigns, and spoke casually about European vacations like everybody lived that way. Meanwhile, I arrived alone carrying an overnight bag, a tired little girl, and 20 years of family disappointment. I'm 39 years old, Army veteran, divorced, single mother. Retired after medical evacuation service left me with enough knee damage and insomnia to make civilian life feel permanently strange. To my father, those things translated into one simple conclusion: failure. Not dramatic failure. Worse. Embarrassing failure. The kind polite families discuss quietly after church. When I first entered the ballroom that afternoon, Dad barely looked up from his conversation with Claire's future father-in-law. "Well," he muttered, "you made it." I kissed Mom's cheek hello. "You look nice," she whispered quickly, like kindness needed permission in that room. Claire hugged me carefully without wrinkling her dress. "You didn't bring Lucy into the ceremony, right? She's with the childcare room downstairs until reception." Claire visibly relaxed. My sister wasn't cruel exactly, just deeply invested in appearances. That mattered in our family. Always had. Dad spent 40 years building a successful construction company in Dayton. He valued image the way some men value religion. Nice suits, clean reputation, social connections, and children who reflected well on him publicly. Claire fit perfectly into that vision. I never did. Even as a kid, I was quieter than the rest of them. More comfortable beside Grandpa Walter in his garage listening to old Vietnam stories than attending country club dinners with Dad's business friends. After 9/11, while Claire planned sorority rush events at Ohio State, I enlisted in the Army. Dad reacted like I'd announced plans to disappear into a circus. "You're too smart for military life," he snapped back then. "That's where people go when they run out of better options." Grandpa Walter nearly punched him for saying it. I still remember that kitchen silence afterward. Old veterans understand certain insults differently than civilians do. But Dad never apologized. And over the years, every deployment widened the distance between us. I missed birthdays, Christmases, anniversaries. Then my marriage collapsed during my 3rd overseas rotation. My husband finally admitted he was tired of living around Army schedules, emergency calls, and emotional exhaustion he didn't understand anymore. By 36, I came home permanently retired with joint pain panic attacks during thunderstorms and a 3-year-old daughter depending entirely on me. Dad looked at my life and saw wasted potential. Claire's life looked prettier in photographs. That mattered to him. So by the time the wedding reception began, I already knew my role. Quiet sister, former soldier. Family cautionary tale. The humiliation happened halfway through dinner. Dad had been drinking steadily since cocktail hour while entertaining guests at our table. Stories. Politics. Golf talk. The louder he got, the more reckless his mouth became. Then one of Claire's new in-laws asked politely what I did before retirement. Dad laughed before I could answer. "Oh, Rebecca." He waved dismissively with his wine glass. "She's just a pathetic veteran." A few uncomfortable chuckles moved around the table. Dad kept going. "Spent years in uniform, came home divorced, busted up knees, no real career." He smirked. "Now she's raising a kid alone and living off army stories." People laughed harder this time. Not cruel laughter, exactly. Worse. Social laughter. The kind people use when they don't want dinner becoming uncomfortable. I felt my face burn hot instantly. But army training teaches emotional control better than most therapy programs. So I sat there quietly, folding my napkin smaller and smaller beneath the table, while my father publicly dismantled my life in front of strangers. Mom stared at her plate. Claire pretended not to hear it. And suddenly I was 23 again, standing in airport terminals alone after deployments, wondering why coming home always felt lonelier than leaving. Then everything changed. The ballroom doors opened. At first nobody reacted. Then whispers started. "Oh my God. Is that Governor Mercer?" People turned in waves. Even the band stopped playing. And through those massive ballroom doors walked Daniel Mercer himself, wearing a dark overcoat, holding my daughter Lucy gently by the hand. The governor scanned the room once before spotting me immediately. Then he smiled. Not political smiling. Real recognition. Real warmth. And he walked directly toward our table. Lucy pointed excitedly. "There's Mommy." Governor Mercer stopped beside me while stunned silence swallowed the room whole. "There you are, Captain Hayes," he said calmly. "Your daughter was worried when she couldn't find you." Nobody at that table moved. Nobody breathed. Dad's shattered wine glass glittered across the marble floor beside his chair. Then Governor Mercer looked around slowly at the wedding guests, still staring in disbelief. And finally he asked the question that changed my family forever. "Mind if I sit with the people who raised America's bravest rescue officer?" Nobody answered Governor Mercer immediately. The ballroom had gone so quiet I could hear silverware clinking somewhere near the kitchen doors. My father still stood frozen beside the shattered wine glass, while half the wedding guests stared between him and me like they'd accidentally walked into the wrong story. Then Governor Mercer smiled politely toward the nearest waiter. "Careful there," he said, nodding toward the broken crystal on the floor. "Wouldn't want anybody getting hurt." Only then did people begin moving again. The spell cracked. Soft whispers spread through the ballroom. "Oh my Lord. That's actually him. How does he know Rebecca?" My daughter Lucy climbed into my lap while I tried to steady my breathing. Because here's the truth, nobody tells you about humiliation. Sometimes the pain doesn't hit hardest when strangers mock you. Sometimes it hits hardest when the people who are supposed to protect you stay silent while it happens. Mom still couldn't look directly at me. Claire looked furious not at Dad but at the attention shifting away from her wedding. And my father, he suddenly seemed desperate to rewrite the last 5 minutes of his life. "Well, Governor Mercer," he stammered awkwardly, forcing a laugh, "what an honor this is." Mercer nodded politely but didn't take the bait. "I'm here for Captain Hayes." That sentence landed like another dropped glass. Captain Hayes, not Rebecca. Not Becca, not your daughter. The governor of Ohio had just identified me by military rank in front of everyone who spent years treating my service like an embarrassing phase. Dad pulled out a chair immediately. "Please sit down." Mercer thanked him and took the seat directly beside me while Lucy rested her head sleepily against my shoulder. He looked toward her warmly. "You found your mother after all." Lucy nodded seriously. "I got lost." Mercer smiled. "Happens to the best of us." Then he glanced toward me. "You okay?" Simple question. Quiet question. But it nearly broke me right there at the reception table because he asked it like somebody who genuinely cared about the answer. I gave a small nod. "I'm fine." Mercer studied my face for a second longer like he knew better. Then he turned calmly toward the rest of the table. "I apologize for arriving uninvited," he said. But when I heard Captain Hayes planned to leave quietly before the reception ended, I decided to interfere. Nobody knew how to respond to that. Claire finally forced a smile. "Well, we're honored you came, Governor." Mercer nodded courteously. "Beautiful wedding." But his attention kept drifting back toward me and Lucy. That didn't go unnoticed. One of Claire's new in-laws leaned forward carefully. "How exactly do you know Rebecca?" The entire table went still again. Dad tried smiling through visible panic. "Oh, I'm sure it's just some army connection." "It's not," Mercer interrupted gently. That shut my father up immediately. Mercer folded his hands together on the table. 3 years ago, eastern Kentucky experienced catastrophic flooding after record rainfall. He looked around the table slowly. Entire towns were underwater within hours. Several guests nodded vaguely, remembering news coverage. My daughter and grandson were trapped inside a community hospital evacuation zone. I felt my stomach tighten already, because I knew where this story was heading. Mercer continued calmly. Roads collapsed. Emergency crews couldn't reach the building safely. He paused. Most people there believed they were going to die. Nobody in the ballroom seemed interested in wedding cake anymore. Then Mercer looked directly at me. Captain Hayes coordinated the evacuation operation. The room went silent. Not socially silent, emotionally silent. The kind where people suddenly realize they may have misunderstood someone completely. Dad blinked rapidly. "You never told us about that." I answered quietly without looking at him. "You never asked," Mercer continued. "She led rescue extractions for nearly 19 straight hours." His voice remained calm but carried unmistakable respect. Floodwater reached second-story windows before the final helicopter cleared the roof. Claire stared at me in open confusion now. Mom covered her mouth slowly with one hand, and Dad looked like somebody had physically struck him. Mercer leaned back slightly. "My grandson survived because your daughter refused to abandon that hospital." Nobody spoke. The reception hall suddenly felt too warm, too bright, too exposed. One of the wedding guests whispered softly, "Oh my God." Dad cleared his throat awkwardly. "Rebecca, why wouldn't you tell the family something like that?" I finally looked at him directly. And for the first time in years, I answered honestly. "Because every time I talked about military work, you treated it like I was bragging." That hit harder than anger ever could have. Dad opened his mouth, then closed it again. No defense came out. Because there wasn't one. Mercer studied my father quietly before speaking again. "You know, he said most decorated service members don't talk much about what they've done." He glanced toward me. "They usually learned long ago nobody wants to hear difficult things." I stared down at Lucy's small hand wrapped around my fingers. The ballroom buzzed softly now with whispered conversations spreading table to table. People were staring differently. Not pity. Not amusement. Respect. And honestly, that almost made me more uncomfortable. Because I'd spent years surviving invisibly. Sudden admiration feels strange after long emotional neglect. Claire shifted stiffly beside her husband. "So Rebecca saved your family." Mercer smiled faintly. "She saved dozens of families." Then he added something that stunned even me. "She also declined every major media interview afterward." Dad frowned in confusion. "Why would she do that?" I laughed softly under my breath before answering. "Because I knew nobody back home would believe it mattered anyway." Mom quietly began crying. Not dramatic crying. Small, older woman tears she tried hiding with napkins. Dad noticed too late. That's another thing older families understand. Well, sometimes people don't become emotional because of one moment. Sometimes emotion arrives all at once after years of accumulated failure. Mercer reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded newspaper clipping. He handed it carefully toward my father. Dad unfolded it slowly. I recognized the photograph instantly. Me standing knee-deep in floodwater beside a rescue helicopter soaked to the bone carrying an elderly woman wrapped in thermal blankets. I hated that picture. Mercer's voice softened. My office wanted to honor her publicly afterward. He looked toward Dad. She asked us not to. Dad stared at the photo with trembling hands. "Why?" This time Mercer didn't answer. I did. Because I was tired of trying to prove my life mattered to people who already made up their minds about me. The silence afterward felt endless. Even the ballroom staff seemed quieter now. Finally, Mercer leaned closer toward my father. Not aggressive, not cruel, just painfully sincere. "Sir," he said softly, "your daughter spent years becoming the kind of American most people only pretend to be." Dad's eyes filled instantly, and sitting there watching the strongest man I knew suddenly look small in front of the entire wedding reception, I realized something unexpected. For the first time in my life, my father wasn't embarrassed of me. He was embarrassed of himself. The reception never truly recovered after that. People tried. The band started playing again 20 minutes later, soft jazz drifting awkwardly through the ballroom, while waiters resumed carrying trays of champagne and tiny crab cakes. But the mood had changed completely. Before Governor Mercer arrived, I was the embarrassing veteran sister tucked quietly beside the family centerpiece. Afterward, people kept approaching our table with careful smiles and curious eyes. "Thank you for your service." I had no idea. My son was Army too. That's how Americans over a certain age talk when shame and admiration mix together. quietly, respectfully, like they're trying to fix something without admitting it directly. I smiled politely through most of it, while Lucy eventually fell asleep curled against my shoulder. Governor Mercer stayed nearly an hour, long enough to completely dismantle the version of me my family had spent years constructing. At one point, Claire finally pulled me aside near the restroom hallway. Her wedding dress rustled sharply as she crossed her arms. "Did you know he was coming?" Straight to accusation. Classic Claire. "Number. You honestly expect me to believe that—" I stared at my sister for several seconds before answering. "Claire, I spent 20 years trying not to attract attention in this family. Why would I suddenly orchestrate something like this?" She looked away first, because deep down she knew I was right. Claire grew up in a different emotional climate than I did. Dad praised her constantly. Her piano recitals, cheerleading trophies, beauty pageants when she was younger. Everything Claire did became family conversation. Everything I did became background noise. And over time, favoritism becomes invisible to the people benefiting from it. Claire softened slightly. "Well, tonight was supposed to be about my wedding." There it was. The real fear, not embarrassment. Competition. I sighed quietly. I never wanted this to happen here. She studied me carefully then, and for the first time in years, I think my sister actually saw how tired I looked. Not physically tired, soul tired. The kind veterans carry after too many years surviving emotionally disconnected lives. Claire lowered her voice. "Did things overseas really get that bad?" I almost laughed at the question. Not because it was cruel, because civilians never know how to ask about war. They ask carefully like pain might explode if handled incorrectly. Sometimes they're right. I leaned against the hallway wall while soft wedding music echoed from the ballroom. "There are things you don't come back from completely," I answered honestly. Claire swallowed hard. Then she surprised me. "I used to think Dad was hardest on you because you were stronger." I looked at her sharply. "What?" She stared toward the ballroom doors. "He expected me to need protecting." Her voice softened. "But he expected you to survive everything." That sentence followed me the rest of the night, because it felt painfully true. Back at the reception table, Governor Mercer was speaking quietly with my mother. Mom looked overwhelmed. Not by politics, by guilt. Years of it. When she saw me approaching, she stood immediately. "Rebecca, can we talk tomorrow before you leave?" There was desperation in her voice now. Fear, too. Like she suddenly realized how much of my life happened outside the boundaries of family attention. I nodded gently. "Okay." Mom touched my arm softly. "You really saved people during that flood?" I almost smiled sadly. "Mom, I spent 15 years evacuating wounded soldiers and civilians." Her eyes filled again. I don't know why I never asked more questions. Neither did I. Governor Mercer stood once I returned to the table. I should let this family breathe now. Dad stood immediately too. "No, please." Mercer shook his head kindly. "Your daughters carried enough attention for one evening." Then he looked directly at my father. "Richard, may I say something before I leave?" Dad nodded stiffly. Mercer adjusted his coat slowly. "When veterans stop talking about what they survived," he said quietly, "families often mistake silence for lack of accomplishment." Nobody interrupted. Mercer's eyes shifted briefly toward me. "But silence usually means the memories cost too much to explain." Dad lowered his gaze instantly, because suddenly the whole room understood something important. My quietness had never been weakness. It had been weight. Mercer shook my father's hand politely, then mine. But before leaving, he bent slightly beside Lucy, still asleep against my shoulder. "Your mama's a hero," he whispered softly. I felt tears threaten immediately. Not because of the word hero. I've never liked that word much. Too dramatic. Too simple. But because he said it so naturally to my daughter. Like Lucy should grow up knowing her mother mattered. Mercer finally left through the ballroom doors and conversation slowly returned afterward. But differently now. People watched me carefully. Respectfully. Even Dad barely spoke for the next hour. The loud, confident contractor everybody admired had vanished somewhere between the shattered wine glass and the flood rescue story. By 10:30, guests began leaving. Claire and her husband departed through sparklers and applause, while I slipped quietly toward the coat room carrying Lucy wrapped in a blanket. I almost made it outside unnoticed. Then Dad's voice stopped me. "Rebecca." I turned slowly. He stood alone near the lobby fireplace, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Not physically. Emotionally. Like somebody had forced him to rewatch 30 years of parenting in a single evening. Snow fell softly beyond the glass entrance doors behind him. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Dad rubbed one hand over his face and exhaled shakily. I didn't know. I stared at him quietly. And here's the difficult thing about late apologies. Sometimes they're sincere, but still painfully incomplete. What exactly didn't you know? I asked softly. Dad looked stunned by the question, like he genuinely never considered how broad the damage might be. Finally he answered, that your life turned out? He struggled for words. Important. Important. Not meaningful. Not honorable. Important. I almost smiled from exhaustion. My life was always important, I answered quietly. You just valued different things. That hit him hard. Hard enough his eyes reddened immediately. I thought I pushed you because I wanted you stronger. I shifted Lucy higher against my shoulder. No, Dad. My voice stayed calm. You pushed me because you thought I embarrassed you. The silence afterward stretched painfully long. And for the first time in my entire life, my father didn't argue back. Because somewhere deep down he finally understood it was true. I barely slept that night. Lucy and I stayed at a small Hampton Inn 20 minutes outside Columbus, the kind built beside highways where the heating system hums constantly, and every room smells faintly like old coffee and carpet cleaner. Lucy slept peacefully across the other bed, surrounded by stuffed animals and wedding candy she'd smuggled into my overnight bag. Children recover from emotional tension faster than adults. At 3 years old, she thought the wedding had been exciting. Pretty dresses, cake, music, a nice man helping her find mommy. She had no idea she accidentally detonated 30 years of family denial simply by holding Governor Mercer's hand. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and sat beside the window watching snow fall across the empty parking lot. That's the thing about military life. Even after retirement, your body never fully forgets vigilance. You learn how to sleep lightly, how to listen constantly, how to live prepared for interruption. War changes ordinary silence forever, and civilian families rarely understand that. By sunrise, my knees already ached from weather pressure rolling through Ohio. Old Army injuries always predict snow better than meteorologists. Lucy woke cheerful around 7:30 asking for waffles. Children also don't understand emotional collapse. Thank God for that. While she watched cartoons and drowned waffles and syrup downstairs at the hotel breakfast area, my phone buzzed twice. One missed call from Mom. One text from Dad. Can we talk before you leave town? No apology. No explanation. Just those 8 words. I stared at the screen a long time before answering. Finally, I texted, we can meet after lunch. Almost immediately, Dad replied, thank you. That bothered me more than anger would have, because my father never thanked me for emotional space before. Back when I was younger, conversations happened on his terms, his timing, his comfort level. But humiliation changes people, especially public humiliation. By noon, snow covered most of Columbus in gray winter slush. I drove Lucy to a small diner outside Dayton that Grandpa Walter used to love when I was a kid. Maple Street Grill. Red vinyl booths. Bad coffee. Waitresses who still called everyone hon. Grandpa brought me there after Little League games because he hated country clubs and loved pie. Dad arrived alone 10 minutes later wearing the same suit from the wedding under a heavy winter coat. He looked terrible. Not drunk. Worse, sober and reflective. That kind of exhaustion hits older men differently. Like regret physically weighs something. Lucy waved happily when she saw him. Grandpa. Dad's entire face softened instantly. He hugged her carefully before sitting across from me. For a few minutes, conversation stayed safely focused on Lucy. School. Cartoons. Chocolate milk. Then the waitress took our orders, and silence settled over the booth. Dad folded his hands together slowly. I owe you an apology. There it was. The sentence I imagined hearing most of my adult life, and somehow it still didn't feel satisfying. Because older wounds don't disappear the moment somebody acknowledges them. I embarrassed you publicly, Dad continued quietly, and I was wrong. I nodded once. Yes. He flinched slightly at how quickly I answered, probably because part of him still hoped I'd soften things for his comfort. That used to be my role in this family. Emotional shock absorber. Not anymore. Dad stared out the diner window for several seconds before speaking again. When Governor Mercer started talking last night, he shook his head slowly. I realized I don't actually know what your life's been. I stirred cream into my coffee quietly. You knew the parts you wanted to know. That landed hard. Dad sighed heavily. You really think I cared that little? I looked at him carefully then. And for the first time in years, I decided complete honesty mattered more than peacekeeping. Yes, I answered softly, I do. The diner noise faded around us. Coffee cups clinking. Country music playing low near the kitchen. Snowplows groaning somewhere outside. Dad rubbed his jaw slowly. I thought giving you space meant respecting your independence. No, I said calmly. You gave Claire attention. You gave me distance. He looked down immediately because he knew exactly what I meant. Claire received encouragement, involvement, pride, emotional investment. I received assumptions, criticism, and silence mistaken for toughness. Dad swallowed hard. I honestly believed you didn't need much from us. That nearly made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it's one of the saddest parenting mistakes in America. The quiet child becomes invisible simply because they aren't demanding attention loudly enough. I needed exactly what Claire needed, I said softly. You just decided she deserved it more. Dad's eyes reddened instantly. Before he could answer, Lucy suddenly interrupted from beside me. Mommy cries in her sleep sometimes. The world stopped. Dad looked at her sharply. Lucy kept coloring on her kid's menu innocently. She says names too. Lucy looked up thoughtfully. Sometimes she says, "Don't leave him there." My chest tightened painfully. Combat memories. Nightmares. Things I worked very hard to hide from my daughter. Dad stared at me in stunned silence. You still have nightmares? I looked away toward the snowy parking lot. Sometimes. How bad? I laughed quietly under my breath. Dad, I spent years loading 19-year-old soldiers into helicopters missing limbs. His face crumpled slightly. You never told us. There it was again. The sentence haunting this entire family. You never told us, as if emotional understanding only belongs to the person brave enough to speak first. I leaned forward slowly. You never asked because you didn't want difficult answers. Dad opened his mouth, then stopped. Because again, it was true. He wanted simple military stories. Patriotic stories. Safe stories, not trauma, not grief, not lifelong psychological cost. The waitress returned with burgers and fries, mercifully interrupting the tension. Dad barely touched his food. Finally, after several silent minutes, he said something unexpected. Your grandfather warned me. I looked up immediately. What? Dad nodded slowly. Walter told me years ago I was treating you differently. That hurt more than I expected. Did Mom know? Yes. I sat back, slowly absorbing that. Dad stared down at his untouched fries. He told me something after your second deployment. Dad's voice roughened. Richard, one day your daughter's gonna stop trying to earn love from this family, and when that happens, you'll realize how much of her life you missed. Grandpa Walter, always seeing things clearly before everyone else. I swallowed hard. Dad finally met my eyes again. And Rebecca... His voice trembled slightly now. I think that day finally came last night. After lunch, Dad followed me outside into the diner parking lot, while Lucy stayed inside choosing candy from the old machine near the register. Snow crunched beneath our shoes, cold wind rolled across the empty road, and for a moment we stood there beside my SUV like two strangers trying to figure out whether rebuilding something broken was even possible at our age. Dad shoved both hands into his coat pockets. When's the last time you were happy? The question caught me off guard. Not because it was complicated, because my father had never asked me anything emotional before. I stared across the snow-covered fields beyond the highway. I don't know. Dad nodded slowly like that answer hurt him. When your grandfather came home from Vietnam, he said quietly he barely talked for almost 2 years. I looked at him carefully. Dad rarely discussed Grandpa Walter's service. He used to sit in the garage at night pretending to fix things. Dad gave a faint, sad smile. Most of the time he was just sitting there listening to baseball games on the radio. The cold air smelled like gasoline and wet asphalt. He ever talked to you about the war, I asked. Dad shook his head. Not really, then he added softly, but your grandmother said he screamed in his sleep sometimes. That didn't surprise me. Trauma travels through generations more quietly than people realize, especially in military families. Dad exhaled slowly. I think maybe I spent my whole life trying not to become him. What do you mean? He came home sad. Dad's eyes stayed fixed on the road, and I decided early that sadness made men weak. That explained almost everything. Why emotional conversations disappeared in our house. Why praise always sounded uncomfortable coming from him. Why vulnerability immediately turned into criticism. Dad spent 40 years treating softness like danger, and somewhere along the way I became collateral damage. He rubbed snow from the hood of my SUV absently. When you joined the army, I was terrified. I blinked in surprise. You were angry. I was both. He looked at me directly now. I knew what military life did to your grandfather. Then suddenly my daughter volunteers for it after 9/11. He shook his head. I thought I was losing you. That complicated something inside me. Because pain becomes confusing when you finally discover fear hiding underneath cruelty. Dad continued quietly. But every time you came home you looked— He searched for the word, older. I almost laughed softly. War ages people unevenly. Not always physically, emotionally. You come home carrying images civilians never had to make room for inside their heads. Dead teenagers. Mothers screaming inside evacuation zones. Friends pretending they're fine while slowly collapsing psychologically. You learn how fragile ordinary life really is. And after enough years, regular conversations start feeling strangely small. Dad leaned against the SUV door. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. There it was. The sentence sitting underneath our entire relationship. Not hatred. Not disappointment. Fear mixed with emotional incompetence. Older American men were raised inside emotional silence so deep they often mistook distance for stability. Dad suddenly looked exhausted again. Governor Mercer called me this morning. I frowned immediately. He did what? He wanted to make sure you were okay after the wedding. That irritated me and touched me at the same time. What else did he say? Dad swallowed hard. He told me I should look up the Kentucky rescue reports. I went still. Because those reports weren't easy reading. Dad continued quietly. So I did. I already knew where this was going. The official reports included casualty projections, civilian fatalities, weather conditions, helicopter risk assessments, and body recovery estimates if the hospital evacuation failed. Dad's face looked pale remembering it. You never told us helicopters almost crashed trying to reach the roof. I shrugged faintly. Didn't seem useful. Dad stared at me like he didn't recognize the person standing in front of him anymore. Then slowly, painfully, he asked, How many people died while you were serving? That's not a number veterans carry neatly. Loss becomes cumulative after enough years. Faces blur together. Names stay longer. I folded my arms against the cold. Enough. Dad nodded once. Then unexpectedly tears filled his eyes. Not dramatic crying. Older man crying. Quiet and ashamed. I called you pathetic. I looked away. Because hearing him finally understand the cruelty of it hurt almost worse than the original insult. Dad wiped his face quickly. All those years. His voice cracked slightly. You were carrying things I never even tried to understand. The parking lot remained empty except for us, snow drifting softly around old wounds finally spoken aloud. Then Dad reached carefully into his coat pocket and removed a folded envelope. I almost forgot. I frowned. What's that? Your mother found it after the wedding. He handed it toward me. My stomach tightened immediately when I recognized the handwriting. Grandpa Walter. Even after all these years I knew his handwriting instantly. The envelope simply said, For Rebecca, when she finally stops apologizing for who she became. My chest tightened painfully. Dad spoke softly. He wrote it before he died. I stared at the envelope for several long seconds before opening it carefully with numb fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter on old lined paper. Rebecca, if you're reading this, then life probably turned out exactly the way I worried it would. Your father loves hard work appearances and respectability because those things helped him survive his own fears. But fear has a way of turning people emotionally blind, especially men. I already felt tears building. Dad looked away respectfully while I kept reading. You and I were built differently. Some people survive difficult things and become harder. Some survive difficult things and become deeper. Don't let anybody convince you the second kind is weakness. I swallowed hard. The snow around us suddenly blurred. Walter continued. One day your father will realize strength isn't loudness, criticism, or control. Real strength is tenderness that survives disappointment. And Becca, if the world ever makes you feel small for serving others, quietly remember this. The people who carry the heaviest things rarely brag about it. By then, my hands were trembling. At the bottom of the page, Grandpa had written one final sentence. I was proud of you long before anybody important learned your name. Dad stared at me carefully after I finished. And standing there in that freezing Ohio parking lot holding my grandfather's final words, I realized something heartbreaking. The only person who truly understood me had been preparing me for this family my entire life. I didn't leave Ohio after the wedding. That surprised everybody. Honestly, it surprised me too. For years, my coping strategy had been simple leave before disappointment settles in too deeply. Leave the family gathering. Leave the awkward conversation. Leave before emotional neglect hardens into humiliation. Military life makes leaving easy. You learn how to detach quickly because attachment becomes dangerous when deployments keep tearing life apart every few years. But Grandpa Walter's letter stayed in my coat pocket like unfinished business. And for the first time in a very long while, my father seemed genuinely afraid of losing me completely. So Lucy and I stayed another 3 days. Mom invited us to the house for Sunday dinner. The same house where I grew up. The same dining room where Dad once told 15-year-old me, "You'd be prettier if you smiled more." The same kitchen where he laughed after I enlisted and said, "Well, at least one kid's guaranteed not to become high maintenance." Funny how families remember different versions of history. When I arrived Sunday afternoon, Mom had cooked too much food the way anxious mothers always do when emotions overwhelm them. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, biscuits, cherry pie cooling near the window. Claire was already there wearing expensive cream-colored sweaters that somehow survived spaghetti sauce and motherhood untouched. Her husband Evan sat quietly helping Lucy color at the table. Claire looked uncomfortable when I entered. Not hostile anymore, just uncertain. That was new. Dad stood near the kitchen counter holding a bowl of salad like he wasn't entirely sure what to do with his own hands. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey." No tension exploded. No dramatic speeches. Just older people slowly realizing relationships don't repair themselves overnight. That's more realistic anyway. Most families heal awkwardly. Dinner started cautiously. Safe topics. Weather. Traffic. Lucy's preschool obsession with dinosaurs. Then, halfway through dessert, Claire finally broke the emotional stalemate. I looked up the Kentucky flood rescue. The room quieted immediately. I kept my eyes on my coffee. Claire swallowed awkwardly. "They said you went back onto the roof after the evacuation order ended." Dad stared at me sharply. "You never told me that part." "There wasn't much to tell." Claire frowned. The report said another helicopter pilot refused because visibility collapsed. I shrugged faintly. One patient was still trapped upstairs. Dad looked genuinely horrified now. "You could have died." That sentence always sounds strange coming from civilians. Because veterans stop measuring danger emotionally after enough exposure. Risk becomes procedural, mission-focused, ordinary. I stirred sugar slowly into my coffee. A lot of people could have died. Dad leaned back heavily in his chair. "You had a daughter already." That one landed differently. Because he wasn't criticizing. He was imagining loss. I looked toward Lucy laughing beside Evan over crayons and dinosaur stickers. "Yes," I answered quietly. "That's why I went back. Nobody spoke after that." Sometimes civilians assume courage comes from fearlessness. Usually it comes from responsibility instead. Claire stared at me carefully. "I don't understand how you carried all this without talking about it." I almost smiled sadly. "You grew up in the same house I did." That shut the table quiet again. Dad rubbed his forehead slowly. Then, unexpectedly, Claire spoke again. "You know what's weird? She looked embarrassed admitting it. I used to be jealous of you." I blinked. "What?" Claire laughed softly without humor. "You got freedom I never had." I honestly didn't know how to process that sentence. Claire continued carefully. "Dad expected me to stay polished all the time." She looked down at her coffee. Perfect daughter, perfect wife, perfect social life. Mom shifted uncomfortably because she knew it was true. Claire sighed. "You were allowed to leave." That hit harder than I expected. Because all my life I thought Claire received all the love while I inherited all the distance. But favoritism damages children differently depending on which role they're assigned. Golden children become trapped too. Dad suddenly looked exhausted again. "I failed both of you in different ways." Nobody argued. Because healing starts when people stop defending themselves against obvious truth. Then the doorbell rang. Dad frowned. "Who's that?" Mom stood carefully, probably Harold. A strange warmth moved through me instantly. Harold Bennett had served with Grandpa Walter in Vietnam. He was 81 now and still wore old flannel jackets that smelled faintly like motor oil and pipe tobacco. When Mom opened the door, Harold stepped inside carrying a cardboard box under one arm. Well, he grumbled warmly, spotting me, "There's my favorite soldier." I hugged him harder than expected. Harold squeezed my shoulder gently. "Your grandfather would have loved this mess." Dad gave a tired laugh from the table. "That obvious?" Frank emotional disasters are obvious from the driveway in this family. Even Dad smiled at that. Harold set the cardboard box carefully onto the dining table. "What's this?" I asked. "Walter's old things." I frowned in surprise. I thought Grandma threw most of it away. "She kept more than you think." Harold looked toward Dad briefly. "Told me to give this to Rebecca when the timing finally made sense." Inside the box were Faded military photographs, service medals, handwritten journals, old newspaper clippings, and cassette tapes labeled with dates from the 70s. I carefully picked up one folded clipping. My throat tightened immediately. It was a newspaper article about my promotion to captain 15 years earlier. Dad stared at it in shock. "You kept that." Harold chuckled softly. "Walter bought 6 copies. I suddenly couldn't breathe quite right, because nobody in my family even attended that promotion ceremony. I'd stood alone afterward, eating dry sheet cake beside officers who received congratulatory hugs from proud parents and spouses. Meanwhile, Grandpa Walter secretly bought 6 newspaper copies. Harold reached into the box again. Then he handed Dad something carefully. Another clipping. This one from my retirement ceremony. Dad unfolded it slowly, and I watched his face collapse. Because taped neatly inside was one of Grandpa Walter's handwritten notes. "Frank, if you cannot see honor in your daughter's life, the problem is not her life." Nobody moved. Dad stared at the note like it physically wounded him. Harold sat quietly at the table. "Walter worried about Rebecca," he said softly. "Not because she was weak, because she spent too many years trying to earn love from people who should have given it freely." Dad covered his mouth with one trembling hand. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father cry without trying to hide it immediately. 2 weeks later, Governor Mercer invited me to the Ohio Veterans Leadership Ceremony in Columbus. I almost declined. Old habits. Veterans like me learn to avoid attention whenever possible. Recognition feels dangerous after enough years spent surviving quietly. But Harold convinced me to go. "Your grandfather spent his whole life watching good people disappear into silence," he told me over the phone. "Don't make his mistake, too." So, on a cold Thursday evening in February, I drove downtown wearing my old dark blue army dress uniform for the first time in nearly 3 years. Lucy sat in the back seat humming to herself while snow flurries drifted across the windshield. "You look pretty mommy," she said. I smiled softly. "Thank you, Bug." Truthfully, the uniform still complicated me emotionally. Part of me missed what it represented: purpose, discipline, clarity. Another part remembered exactly what it cost. The ceremony took place inside the Ohio State House Rotunda. Nothing flashy. Mostly older veterans, emergency responders, military families, and state officials gathered beneath marble columns and warm yellow lighting. Real Americans, the kind who clap politely and mean it. Dad arrived with Mom 10 minutes after us. He wore his best gray suit. Not the expensive, confident version of himself from Claire's wedding. This version looked humbler somehow. More careful. When he saw me in uniform, he stopped walking for a second. And I understood why. For years, Dad mostly associated my military service with absence, missed holidays, strained conversations, divorce, distance. But standing there inside that marble building surrounded by veterans who immediately recognized my insignia and greeted me respectfully, I think he finally saw the life I actually lived instead of the one he imagined. An older Navy veteran shook my hand firmly near the entrance. "Captain Hayes," he said warmly, "heard about Kentucky. Hell of an operation." "Thank you, sir." Another woman approached moments later wearing firefighter dress blues. "My brother was evacuated from that hospital." Her eyes softened. "He talks about you all the time." Dad overheard every word. And slowly throughout the evening, something inside him kept unraveling. People kept stopping me. Not celebrity treatment. Not hero worship. Something quieter. Professional respect. Earned respect. The kind built slowly through years of difficult work nobody sees publicly. Dad stood beside Mom watching it happen like he'd accidentally discovered an entirely different daughter hidden beneath the one he spent years criticizing. At one point, an older Marine colonel approached Dad directly. "You Rebecca's father?" Dad nodded carefully. The colonel smiled. "You raised one hell of an officer." Dad looked stunned. And for the first time in my life, I watched praise about me land inside him without resistance. Governor Mercer arrived shortly before the ceremony started. The room shifted subtly when he entered. Not fear exactly. Presence. Some people carry authority quietly. Mercer crossed the rotunda greeting veterans by first name before spotting Lucy near the refreshment table. "Well, there's my favorite navigator," he said warmly. Lucy giggled immediately. Dad watched that interaction carefully, still trying to understand how deeply connected Mercer already felt to our lives. The governor eventually joined us near the seating area. He shook Dad's hand politely. "Richard." "Governor." Mercer glanced toward me in uniform. "Captain Hayes cleans up pretty well." Dad laughed softly, and hearing my father laugh proudly instead of sarcastically about me felt so unfamiliar it nearly hurt. The ceremony began a few minutes later. A military quartet played softly while officials honored firefighters, medics, rescue teams, and veterans from around the state. Nothing dramatic, just ordinary Americans quietly recognized for difficult service. Then Governor Mercer stepped behind the podium. After opening remarks, he paused unexpectedly and looked directly toward me. "There's someone here tonight," he said calmly, "who spent most of her career avoiding recognition." I immediately wanted to disappear. Mercer smiled faintly, which usually means somebody else had to tell her story first. Light laughter moved gently through the audience. Then his voice grew more serious. 3 years ago, catastrophic flooding trapped dozens of civilians inside a Kentucky hospital evacuation zone. He paused. Most rescue teams withdrew after conditions became too dangerous. The room quieted completely. Captain Rebecca Hayes did not. I stared down at my hands immediately, because memory works strangely. People hear rescue stories and imagine cinematic courage. I remember screaming wind, cold water, fuel smell, and terrified civilians trying not to drown. Mercer continued. She coordinated evacuations under conditions later described by federal responders as nearly impossible. Dad sat completely motionless beside Mom now. Mercer looked around the rotunda slowly. "But what impresses me most about Captain Hayes isn't what happened during the flood." His eyes shifted toward me again. "It's what happened afterward." The silence deepened. She returned home quietly, raised her daughter, lived modestly, asked for no recognition, and continued helping veterans transition back into civilian life. That part surprised even Dad, because I never told my family about volunteering at veteran counseling groups. Mercer smiled gently. "Some of the strongest Americans are the people nobody notices because they stopped needing applause." I felt tears threatening immediately. Not from the praise, from exhaustion. Because being truly seen after years of invisibility can overwhelm a person unexpectedly. Then Mercer said the sentence that finally broke my father completely. "Captain Hayes represents the best kind of service-quiet sacrifice without bitterness." Dad lowered his head instantly. I saw Mom reach for his hand. The audience applauded warmly. Longer than I expected. Not loud Hollywood applause. Real applause. Older people recognizing something meaningful. Afterward, during the reception downstairs, Dad asked if we could step outside briefly. Snow drifted softly across the State House steps while traffic moved through downtown Columbus below us. Dad stood beside me in silence for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. "I spent years waiting for you to become someone impressive." I said nothing. His eyes reddened in the cold air. "The truth is," he swallowed hard, "you became someone honorable, and I was too emotionally stubborn to recognize the difference." That sentence healed something inside me more than any dramatic apology could have, because honor mattered more to me than success ever did. Dad looked toward the snowy city streets. "I think I owe your grandfather an apology too." I smiled faintly through tears. "You probably do." Dad laughed softly at that. Then, after nearly 40 years of emotional distance, my father put one arm awkwardly around my shoulder. Not polished, not cinematic, just real. And standing there outside the Ohio State House while snow fell quietly around us, I realized revenge had never actually been what I wanted. I wanted to feel visible. I wanted my family to finally understand that surviving difficult things quietly is still a form of greatness.